Hello and welcome to episode 164 of the ANF podcast with me, Scott Casson Rennie, and himself,
Al Coates. There you go.
Alcots.
Yeah. Very happy with myself today.
Oh, yeah? Why?
I have no idea. It's just a
Oh,
general feeling that came out.
so the sunshine, the warmth, spring has sprung. What? Yeah, just
All of that. Yeah, it's just then. I don't know about you, but I get this. This is like a middle-aged person sort of excitement thing. Is that it feels like about 6 weeks ago at 4 o'clock at night it was dark, and then now it's 9 o'clock at night, and I'm going, oh, it's still light, and I just love that sense of there's so much more we can do. So I've been beavering away feverishly and up to no good, and I've had 2 bank holidays, which has been quite dangerous. So I've been very good because
you have been very. I have to say, you have been very good.
I've not texted you.
No, you haven't. In fact, at one point I thought, and Trish said, have you heard from Al lately? I went, no, actually. And he went, have you fallen out with him?
I was literally biting my hands. And so I have been plotting and scheming. So maybe more of that will come true, but it's maybe about, in terms of diversifying the podcasts. That was exciting. But we've had that conversation. I can't say anything until we say that conversation. Yeah. But yes.
And fair to say, yes, you've had 2 bank holidays. We've had 1. So, yeah.
Well, I don't want to get into politics.
No, we won't. Let's not. But just stay off social media when there's something going on in the UK if you live in Ireland. That's what I would say to you.
Yes. I'm not even going to go there because I can just feel my registration sliding away.
Unless it's Eurovision, which is on this week. Eurovision is a little bit different because that's
excellent.
More of an open thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, so today we've got a recording of an interview that I did with Dr. Vicky Baker about her research listening to children and young people who display violence and aggression to their caregivers and parents. So I have to say this is a fantastic interview and a really interesting aspect of research because obviously this is my bread and butter. This is the stuff that I really, really find interesting and personal experience in that. So I'm going to keep the powder dry. Listen to the interview. Vicky is really articulate, and I don't think people will be particularly surprised by what she's found out, but I think people will still find it interesting, and it's just great to get it sort of academically sort of drawn together. I will put a link. I've put a link into the research, and the research is fantastic. Mainly because it's all fantastic, but there's one bit at the very beginning which kind of gives a really good overview of the research that's out there. So I'm not going to say much more than that. Dr. Vicky Baker, fantastic, and she would be. She's very happy for people to talk to us as well. So her email will be in the show notes, and people can get in touch with that. So that's fantastic. But other than that, Scott, I believe that you've been using those finely tuned IT skills to create something for us all. Tell us about your little form that you've made.
Oh, yes. I wondered where you were going with that because just this last couple of weeks has just been absolutely bonkers, generally. Yes, so obviously Adoptive Reference Group, so the ARG, we mention it a few times every so often, but I think that we've decided just to do a little bit more, haven't we? Just do a little bit more because we feel it's a little less when we're asking for people's feedback on stuff for the ARG, which obviously we share stories and we share people's kind of experiences and stuff, rather than someone having to do a ranty email trying to explain stuff. Actually, we've formulated a form, haven't we, from the podcast, which is anonymous, to be honest. It's an online form. It has the questions that we are being asked by the ARG this next quarter. So July is the next meeting. And we have been asked to talk about contact. And when I say contact, don't be writing in and complaining. That is the terminology that we're using in terms of this kind of very what's the word? Kind of experience from adopters. So it's an adoptive parents group. Obviously, there's many more groups that the DFE have.
Yeah.
But this is specifically for adoptive parents to respond to around contact, and both direct and indirect. And anybody who is a regular listener will know that we're very much for language, but actually it's the only way we can describe it at the minute is contact, because that's how it's described, and people refer to it as that, don't they? Doesn't mean to say we like the name, but whatever.
Get on with it. Honestly, man, you've danced around that. You should be a politician.
I'm not. Shut your hole.
Honestly, it's like word salad. Just get on with it, man. Sorry, I'm sorry. That was too far.
I've had a morning of it. All right.
Oh, well, we might want to reflect on that. You look like it. Was it your wedding anniversary, perhaps, last night?
It was, yes. Nothing dirty, just too many wines were consumed by Scotty.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Scott's got his metaphorical sunglasses on and is sipping Alka-Seltzer even as we record.
Baggy eyes and things, and so we've put the form together anyway. I think there's 6 questions in total. You don't have to answer them all if you've no experience of it, but certainly we would like to hear from you. So we will pop the form link into the show notes. Like I say, it's anonymous. You don't even have to put your name in. You don't have to put your email address in. For more than one reason, actually, which I was thinking about, because obviously doing the job I do, I was thinking GDPR and all that sort of stuff. So we don't want your email address, we don't want your name, because then we'd have to be responsible with GDPR and stuff like that.
Oh,
yeah. So fill it in. It's completely, so that's it, really.
What?
And we will submit those.
The thing that's interesting is that obviously you can get, you get national studies and national service, you get empirical research, you get all of that. But I think oftentimes when we go to the DFE, the reason we go to the DFE is the DFE wants to know what is the word on the street, what's happening now, not what is, because they can commission reports that will take 18 months, 2 years, and then it'll come up with a very, and they'll do it really properly and do really well. But what's happening today in terms of the quantity of contact between children and birth parents. So that's it, really. It doesn't. It's limited in its scope, so it's not talking about birth siblings. But so
and it's certainly not an academic kind of research thing either. It's literally a couple of questions on contact. And do you know, I was just thinking there as well was, it doesn't matter at what stage you're at after having children placed with your family. If you've experienced contact, then fill it in. It doesn't matter if you've just had 6 months as new parents, or if you've had 16 years, just crack on and fill it in, because everybody's kind of experiences are absolutely valid, and really we need the data, don't we? So to be able to help with the DFE. So there you go.
Yeah, and we'll be putting that information on our socials and everything, but it's in the show notes, the link to the Google form. Anything else happening? Because it's been quite a busy, frenetic few weeks.
I can't even tell you, because most of it, it's just all there.
You don't even know how you got into work today, do you?
No, I do know that, but it's just been so busy, and man, it's been mad, absolutely mad, with lots of great things happening.
Yeah. And including this stuff with Fiona,
the hairbrush, obviously.
Oh, you're sat in the office, aren't you? And you've got your.
Yes, I am.
It's like a call center for delinquents. I can see it.
It pretty much is. Yeah. I've got 2 delinquents with me today. One's Maggie and one's Rob, and okay.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a vision of.
Maggie's got her Christmas jumper on, so that's
all right. Well,
you're in for a great day when someone comes in a Christmas jumper in the middle of May.
That's perfect. I think the only thing to maybe quickly reflect on, and this was a thing I couldn't remember before we started, is in terms of Fiona Wells and the midweek podcast we did last week, the webcast. Really good response. We then went off and spoke to loads of different people. So we had meetings with the heads of the National Strategic Adoption Board, DFE, Quorum, and not wanting to kind of keeping our powder dry a little bit, but actually starting to think about really ways of supporting families in crisis, because it feels like we need really practical and tangible stuff. So that is continuing to go across this month, because this comes out on the 14th, 12th, 13th. And we're going to be putting out podcasts with people with different experiences, people who've experienced allegations, adoptive parents and stuff. So so we're going to push a few things like that. So just make it, there's a certain flavor to the month, but loads of people coming forward. So thank you everyone who's coming forward, wanting to be on the podcast. We've got, I looked and I've got, it's a bit scary.
Like emails and LinkedIn messages and emails and Facebook messages and Twitter.
Yeah, so I've got enough
Like this
podcasts to last
monster
us
that
till
would,
to July.
and anything beyond that would be out of date. So
Well, it's tricky because I've still got podcasts are recording in February that haven't been released yet with people, so I'm a bit nervous that I'm kind of like saying I'm really sorry, but
I'm just very grateful that there's not tapes. Like it's all on, it's all on the computer. Because can you imagine how full your office would be if we,
it would be like
oh,
my
yeah, it'd be like,
80s bedroom full of
yeah,
C90
yeah,
cassettes.
exactly, yeah, I can
Anywho,
imagine it.
let's
Anyway,
move along quickly. Vicky Baker, Dr. Vicky Baker, fantastic interview. Would love to get people's feedback. And again, if you want to contact her, you can directly and read her research because it is just absolutely cracking. So, on that note, Scott, Bon Jovi.
anchovy.
Today, I'm speaking to Dr. Vicky Baker, who is a lecturer stroke researcher in gender-based violence at the Manchester Metropolitan University. Hello, Vicky.
Hello, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wait, thank you for coming on. And I was really interested to see the research that came out of your PhD. So, as a start point, can you tell us what your PhD is about? And then we'll find out some backstory and why you did it and that kind of thing.
Sure thing. So, my PhD is on young people's experiences of using violence and abuse towards parents. And that was with the sole purpose of really focusing on young people's own personal accounts of why they use violence and abuse at home, what's going on, what are the contexts. So yeah, it was all about sort of platforming young people's voices really in terms of violence and abuse at home.
I mean, I think that when I read that was the nature of your PhD and the research, and we'll put a link to the research because it's on the Holes in the Wall website, and I'm sure it's other places as well, so people can read it, because I think people will be really interested, because that's a voice we just don't hear so often. So what was it that sort of specifically got you into, that made you this area of work, got you into this area of work, but then choosing this specific topic, because it's very specific, isn't it?
Sure. It was, to be honest, it was quite a rambling road. So it wasn't, it started off with one thing, and then it sort of a few steps along the way ended up in the PhD. So I suppose originally I worked for a children's research charity called Dartington Service Design Lab, formerly Dartington Social Research Unit. And they did a lot of research around children in care. And they also did some evaluation work, and that I was involved in that evaluation work, and specifically that was on the Respect Young People's program, which supports families who are experiencing this issue. So I kind of had two ins, as it were. One was that I was responsible for carrying out the evaluation on the RIP program, and so I had sort of insights into this area through that. And then the other was that I was carrying out analyses of sort of patterns of risk and needs and vulnerabilities of children within the care system. And within this, I saw a lot of sort of adoption and fostering breakdowns, essentially, and one of the major reasons being young people's use of violence towards parents and carers. And so it got me really interested in the subject area. A PhD position came up with the Connect Centre at UCLan. And I was just, as I looked into the area further, I was just kind of quite shocked about the fact that there wasn't that much research out there, but also really that there was a real lack of research from young people's own perspectives. And so that's kind of what threw me into deciding to focus on this area. So yeah, there was a few jumps along the way, and I still work with Respect now on the Respect Young People's program. So that's a really enduring sort of relationship, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that is it is really interesting that that it is such an under listened to voice in that kind. I mean, as an area of subject matter, it's quite under reported or under acknowledged, but then within it, this is it's probably the least heard voice. Yeah. And why do you think that is?
I think partly, I say partly, I think a large part is that it is difficult to research with young people. It's quite hard to do. There's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on, which I think comes from quite a protectionist perspective, as in, people within services, schools, they feel like they're protecting young people from having to talk about the experiences they've gone through. But actually, when you look at the research, speaking about experiences of violence, abuse, and trauma actually be really liberating for young people. So we know that's actually, that protectionist perspectives can actually be quite harmful. And when I definitely, when I first started doing the PhD, the aim, everyone has these, really grand aims when they first, of like a super rigorous PhD methodology when they first get going. And then originally I was intending on carrying out the survey, because it was a mixed methods PhD that I did. There was a first phase was a survey, and the second phase was in-depth interviews. And originally my vision was to carry out the survey in a number of schools within the London borough where I lived. And I contacted, it was something like 120 schools, and no school would do it. No school would take part in the research at all. And I think it is really difficult in that situation. You can understand it's not necessarily a priority for schools. And also if young people talk about abuse they're experiencing, they need to have provisions in place to make sure that that's responded to effectively. Not necessarily being in line with what yours might be, and then also this kind of protecting or perceived protection of young people, meaning that it's quite hard to get access, and also young people don't always want to talk about their experiences. Although definitely within my research they were very forthcoming. So I think it depends where they're at in terms of what's going on in their life, the journey, as it were. A lot of the young people I spoke to had moved through that period of time where they'd been.
I mean, I'm presuming that people haven't read the research, so we're going to probably cover a lot of ground about why, what it is, and certainly I'll direct people towards it, because I think it is really interesting. But I suppose my reflections on it was that it was interesting that there was a lot of people sort of reflecting back on their behaviour, and was there an element of actually getting people to acknowledge it? That was the first sort of line to get over and go, well, actually, this did happen, or this is happening.
I think there was definitely a real variety in terms of how young people framed their behaviours at home. So I would say some of the younger participants very much framed it as behaviour that was quite justified.
Right.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, or they definitely wouldn't have labelled it as abusive behaviour. And they definitely use a lot of minimising language. So things like, I pushed her, but I didn't hit her, something like that.
Yeah.
Or, if you, one of the young people said, well, if you go up to someone on the street and take the drink off them, then you're going to get hit, aren't you? Whereas when you actually got to some of the older young people, particularly the older female participants, when I say older, that's kind of 17, 18. They were very much had moved to a position of accepting that the behaviours that they used were harmful and abusive in some cases. Actually, and a lot of those young people found it quite helpful. Having the interviews, they found it quite cathartic, because we tried to do a little bit of reframing in those sessions about, what those experiences might have looked like or felt like from the perspectives of parents, which obviously you have to do extremely sensitively. But where I did use that, which was only a limited number of interviews, because some of them it wouldn't have been appropriate to have done that. But in the interviews where I did, the young person said it was extremely helpful for her in terms of making sense of some of the reasons why she used that behaviour at home, some of the impacts that it had, and the perspectives of her mother at the time. So it was really, quite a powerful experience for myself as well as a researcher, and also, fortunately for the young people taking part, there weren't any young people who came out of those interviews, traumatized from what I could tell and from what their feedback was, which is good evidence for why we should speak to young people about their experience.
Yeah, it's a good start point as a researcher, isn't it? No one was traumatized in the making of this PhD.
Yeah, exactly.
That was one of my questions. Well, I mean, to be honest, I have so many questions, and the more you're talking, there's questions like buffering up inside my head. So I don't think we're going to get too far, to be honest with you. I was going to ask about ethical approval, because it does feel like a sensitive issue, and potentially you're going to have conversations with people who might be. Was there any sort of safety guards around children, because they may say, actually, I am still physically harming someone.
Yeah, sure.
And one of the challenges I always find with this is that this conversation is always framed around child safeguarding and rarely around adult safeguarding. So what was that all? How did that all play into it? It's not a rubbish question. It's more of a point.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, safety is always really important, isn't it? And safeguarding of adults and children within this situation. I was fortunate in that. So the research was carried out across 2 samples, essentially. One was a sixth form college and one was a youth offending service. So the young people within the youth offending service were very much in a supported position, as were the parents of those young people. So they had a key worker. It was a key worker who'd identified these young people as being potential participants, and then the young people and the parents had then consented for the research to go ahead. So they were very much in a supported position. And when things came up, which were potential issues around safeguarding, of which there were both adult and child issues around safeguarding, I would kind of pause the interview, speak to the young person and say, I'm going to have to potentially speak to someone about what you've told me. Is that okay with you? But to be honest, the young people within the youth offending context were very much used to, sadly, working within that kind of safeguarding context. So they're very much used to that, that kind of procedure, as it were, which obviously is extremely sad because they're kind of, it shows the exposure that they have to these services and the fact that they really did go from one service to the next service to the next service across a range of different issues. But it did on the upside mean that they were very well supported. And then after the interviews, I'd speak to the key worker, make sure that they were really aware of some of the issues that were going on. Within the youth offending service, there was a lot around substance misuse, criminality, as you'd assume, but also around violence and abuse at home. And then in the college context, I was just in touch with the safeguarding lead there. And also whenever a safeguarding issue came up, I'd essentially explore the issue further to get a better sense about, was that a present issue? Was that a past issue? Had there been services involved? And did I feel like there needed to be further safeguarding input? So it is something that you do always, that does need to be fully thought out in advance. And I think probably one of the reasons why, some of the schools didn't want to take part, because it is, you can't just say, oh, I heard this thing and I'm going to do anything about it. So, but it is. It makes it tricky. It makes it tricky for sure.
Look, I'm going to have to confess that I'm really struggling in this interview because I've just read. I've got the list of all of your chapters and the chapter titles, and each one of them I go, oh, I've got 3 questions about that. I've got 7 questions about that. Theoretical, conceptual framework, yes. The impact of parenting abuse, prevalence of an incident, defining.
It's huge, isn't it? Yeah. I've got my own notes and I wrote it. I'll be honest.
You got your own questions. Just there's so much to kind of dig into, and I guess what I don't want to do is for me to turn into my personal conversation, because actually, what were the maybe cutting to the end then, really, that having sort of set this framework where you're talking to young people, what are the key takeaways for you as a researcher and a practitioner, because you're working in the field as well, aren't you?
Yeah, so I do work within a research context though. So I work closely with practitioners, but I don't actually practice myself. But so the key takeaways, I think, I said that it was mixed methods. The majority, sort of the bulk of the findings, I would say, came out of those in-depth interviews, those sort of qualitative findings. But there was a lot of interesting insights from the survey as well, because originally I wanted to understand what the prevalence of the issue was, and I decided to do that within the education context. And what kind of came out of it, I suppose, is the importance of how we're defining the issue, how we're kind of operationalizing and defining it within a survey is actually very difficult, because the definition of it in of itself is quite tricky. I know you've spoken to a number of people on this podcast, Helen, about this issue. actually trying to pin down which cases represented child to parent abuse cases and which didn't. That ended up being an exercise in of itself in the PhD, which I found really useful. And I kind of, out of that came around a 10% figure for me, when you're trying to look at both. I know, but when you're trying to look at, if you're taking into consideration physical violence and non-physical forms of violence that are patterned, so that it's happened more than once, that was the figure that I came up with, which, it is a lot, when you're kind of scaling that outwards. However, the kind of the interesting thing, and sort of the reason I brought it up really, is that in the literature, it varies so much when you're talking about prevalence, because, I use an adapted version of the conflict tactics scale, which a lot of other researchers have used. But quite often when they're talking about psychological abuse, some of those sort of items, some of those questions on the surveys, they can be, I annoyed my parent, or I swore at my parent. And then all of a sudden you find these 96% psychological abuse rates. And I think we have to be very careful when we're we're talking about prevalence. What are we actually talking about? What do these figures actually represent? And the problem is no one person is talking about the same thing. And so I found that just that exercise was a finding in of itself. It was 10% for my study. However, it was more about how do we operationalize child to parent abuse within a survey in order to be able to count and understand how common it is as an issue. It's quite a rambling answer, but that was kind of the first half of the PhD.
Well, I think that reflects the nature of the beast, doesn't it? That it is such a complicated issue. And I was going to ask you, I was going to do my best not to ask you about the whole abuse language, because I think...
Sure, it's really difficult.
And it is, isn't it? It's just such a... Having read your research, I totally understand, the you coming from, your work with respect, that it is much more, it's an older group of children, it's a different manifestation of it, but it is still such a, it's maybe not subjective to you because you're a PhD, you're a doctor, so you're much cleverer than me, but it feels subjective to me that how you define it. And because I've worked with families who said they would never categorize it as abuse. Yeah,
sure. And I think, I think it is subjective, and I think it's context dependent, it's family dependent. And, the other side of the research, so the main thrust of it, were young people's own conceptualizations of what their violence and abuse at home, if they even termed it that, which some of them did, some of them didn't. What that meant, where it came from, whether it served any functions. And so that was really, that it was so rich, the information that young people were able to provide. And in some cases, extremely eloquently, and in great depth. And clearly, particularly for those who'd been through therapeutic support, they'd gone through a process of self-reflection that then meant they were really able to articulate quite clearly, some of these contexts. So some of the main ones, if I just kind of got them written in front of me as notes, because it is hard, as you say, it's a bit of a beast, the PhD. But there was kind of 6 key areas, sort of key themes that young people spoke about. The biggest of which was kind of young people's victimization experiences themselves. So young people quite often, this is not to say that this is always the case, because it's not always the case, but within this sample, the majority of young people had experienced some form of victimization, and that was either domestic abuse between parents, it was direct abuse of themselves, either by a parent, caregiver, or someone outside of the family, and also some quite severe peer violence as well. So there was a lot of experiences of victimization. That was the majority of the sample had that. And although there's not one cause, I would say that for a lot of young people that did underpin the rest of those behaviors. So, for example, difficulties with communication with parents, especially where young people had experienced domestic abuse between parents. Obviously, they were traumatized. Their mothers, this was typically mothers, were traumatized. And this meant that they had difficulties communicating with one another because they hadn't had the opportunity to work through that therapeutically, either on their own, separately, or then together. And this meant that those sort of everyday negotiations of power and control in the parent-adolescent relationship, particularly, things around rights, freedoms, allowance for space, requests to do chores, all of a sudden that became highly heated and with limited ability to communicate, difficulties around emotion regulation. So these are all these kind of themes. It wasn't sort of one theme per person. Quite often they all were there interacting with one another. So, and a lot of the young people had experiences of other stress factors. So stress around school, around friends, around relationships. They didn't have these kind of coping resources to draw upon. And this was all of it sort of feeding in, and also context of blame towards mothers for some of the abuse they'd experienced, for the absence of fathers in the home. And this all kind of fed into it's sort of like the sort of a perfect explosion, really, of factors that resulted in this abuse dynamic going on. And in a number of cases, young people were experiencing abuse. They were actually retaliating and using violence in self-defense. So then it throws out that whole use of the term abuse, doesn't it? Can we even talk about child-to-parent abuse in a context of child abuse? So, endlessly discuss that.
It is fascinating. That on that final point, I'm a nonviolent resistance practitioner, and often the conversation around how children perceive children who've experienced adversity, and even very young children there's very little children that experienced it, but then lived out away from that. Children who are reactive to parents and adults' manner in a way that's not proportionate, or not, they're reactive. And so just creates this really complicated soup where parents, sometimes reasonable requests are met with unreasonable responses.
Yeah, sure. But there was a really useful term that I came across actually in the research, which was, I can't remember who used it now, but overactive threat appraisals, which is this kind of sense of rather than starting at a 1, they're already at an 8 or 9. And so anything that is even potentially just a request is seen as some kind of threat and responded to in that way that a threat would be. With violence is grown. And that's not to justify it at all. It's more just to understand the context and to understand where young people are at when they're using these behaviours. So that, practitioners can go in with that understanding. It's sort of meeting young people where they are rather than where you think they should be.
Which I think my experience of working with parents and carers is that sometimes there's a lot of learning to do there, and not to parent blame, because often parents feel blamed. But it's to say, look, if we understand, then we can adjust how we interact.
Sure. And it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to not, but it's hard to say, to hold that space of, we're not blaming young people, but also we're not blaming parents as well. The research that I did really showed quite heavily that mothers really they had a really awful end of the deal. They were trying to deal with their own trauma. They were trying to parent a child with trauma. And that's not to say it's always about trauma, but for a lot of these young people, it was. And I think that for sure, when both parents and young people can have that support that they need separately, and then they can come together therapeutically, I think that's probably where the best progress is going to be made. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to hold the space for both sides.
I met with a woman who had 2 children recently, and she sort of got herself out of domestic abuse situation from her male partner, and now that behavior was then being manifest in this little 9-year-old, and she knew that she wasn't. It was a raw wound for her, and to see this person she loved, this little person, manifesting this behavior she'd seen in this person, it's like you think there is no solution that's simple. And
that's it. Yeah,
everyone needs something in this, and you can't just go to a parent and go, well, put in some firmer boundaries.
Sure. And it's hard, isn't it? Because the problem is as well, is that you're asking parents to make changes, which is necessary, but also potentially they're exhausted. They already feel blamed. They feel like the ball shouldn't be in their courts. I suppose it's just making sure everyone feels heard, really, in the situation. But it is, it's an extremely complex problem to navigate, I think.
Yeah.
And my hat goes off to all the practitioners out there that are doing a fantastic job at trying to address it.
If people say that to me, I just faint. That's what I do. It's my strategy. For getting out of it, just you said you got 6 points, and I may have distracted you somewhere through those points. Did you say you got 6 specific findings?
So like the main themes were, as I say, the underlying experiences of victimization, that navigating power, control, and agency in the parent-child relationship. That was often, if you think about the victimization experiences as laying the kind of foundations of this later on use of violence and abuse at home, you would maybe see the kind of negotiations of power as being that immediate site of where child-to-parent abuse takes place, because it's got those triggers, essentially, requests to do chores, removal of phones. And actually, one of the interesting findings was quite often these were things, removal of something or refusal of something that was sort of addictive or had some sort of dependency around it. So young people using their phones to quite intense levels, and control of that by a parent, resulting in quite an explosive reaction from young people. Same with television, cigarettes, sweets. So things that are kind of, you may have physical or emotional dependencies around. So those were the sort of immediate site of those kind of explosive or abusive interactions. And then the stress and coping contexts, quality of communication. So young people spoke a lot about how they found regulating their emotions difficult, which was another kind of theme, anger and emotion regulation. And that when they were communicating with parents or, negotiating at home, that they found it very difficult if parents increased the volume of those conversations. They found it very difficult to regulate themselves when the sound was turned up, as it was, and also when their space was constrained within that. So forcing them to have a discussion at that moment in time where they were feeling at an 8 or 9, and a lot of the sort of child to parent abuse programs do deal with this quite well, coming back to arguments cold rather than hot. Setting aside safe spaces for young people to calm down, and these are all from my findings, the right things to be doing from young people's perspective. And the last theme was around blame, which was really kind of, I kind of took an in-depth look at young people's language when they were discussing their violence and abuse at home, and some, but not all, used kind of minimizing language, justification. If you do that, you'd expect to get hit, wouldn't you? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And
also something called claims of reduced competence, where you're like, I just blacked out, so whatever happened in that time, that's not on me. I lost it. I couldn't control myself. And these are things that you hear within the broader domestic abuse sort of literature as well. And that's not to say that they directly map onto one another, because we know the power dynamics are extremely different. But there are similarities that can be drawn, and that kind of narrative. Some of the narratives were quite similar. However, with some of the older young people, there was a lot more responsibility being taken for those abusive behaviours, which you don't necessarily see so much in the domestic abuse literature. And then I would say some of the other key findings are. And this contributes towards the whole discussion around intentionality, which is obviously really tricky. Exactly. It's very difficult to navigate. Although I think I'd like to say maybe we're at a place where we can understand that fluctuates, and that can maybe there might be some intention at points and then not at other points. And that is something maybe that changes over time and is quite dynamic and maybe quite fluid, also very context dependent. Potentially child-to-parent violence in the context of neurodivergence versus, not necessarily versus, but or if you're looking at child-to-parent violence and abuse in the context of domestic abuse between parents, sort of direct child abuse, that maybe some of these things might be slightly different. And some of this intentionality might be slightly different.
You're
However,
dancing around this one, aren't you?
I know, it's really tricky. It's really tricky. But anyway, young people kind of framed that their violence and abuse had sort of functions, essentially. That there were certain functions of the violence and abuse. Again, that's not to say it's justified functions, but more that they served a purpose at the time. And these were letting off steam. Particularly, this was around things like the destruction of property at home, punching holes in walls, breaking televisions. That helped them to feel better. Obviously, didn't help parents to feel better, unfortunately. That helped them to, essentially, that was like an unhealthy coping mechanism. Self-defense and retaliation. So that function was, to defend themselves. Another function was, unfortunately, punishing mothers. So violence and abuse at home was a way of punishing mothers for what they had perceived as harms that they had experienced that were their fault. That's how they perceived it at the time. Fortunately, the young people would move past that and saw it in a new light by the time that I'd spoken to them. But that was essentially the function it served at the time. Also communicating distress. A number of young people talked about that they were crying out for help, and that was the only way that they could do that was by being violent at home, to draw attention to some of the distress they were experiencing. And then also to gain back power and control. So when we look at those immediate contexts, they wanted their phones, they wanted to go out with friends, and they felt that in a life where potentially they hadn't had control at other points, and potentially some of those who had been victimized, especially, that this was a way of them gaining power and control where they didn't feel like they had much. Or where they just wanted it. Some of the young people were like, I just want what every teenager wants, to be able to go out whenever I want, to have what I want. So I think that was really useful for me because I think when we say intention and intentionality, it's framed very much as like, are they being a bad child with, malicious intentions of harming somebody? I don't think it doesn't always have to be intention in that sense. I think something can serve a function. It doesn't mean that you're intending on harming someone, or it could be that you're blocking out that is a consequence, conveniently. But
and I think intention is a really fascinating. It's a fascinating word, because what I sometimes do if I'm doing training is I'll put up I think it's the Cottrell definition, which I can't remember word for word, but in the middle of it all, it says that intends to gain power and control.
Yeah, sure.
And if I show that to a group of parents, really often I'll say, what do you think about this? And people will sort of focus in on the word intent. And a lot of people will sort of describe that they don't believe that their child wakes up in the morning and goes, do you know what I'm going to do today?
Sure.
But in that moment of dysregulation, conflict, then there is a real sense of intention.
Yeah, it's a way of getting what I want at that time. I feel uncomfortable with this, boundary being put in place. Yeah. And this is potentially the only way forward that I see in trying to, change the balance of power, essentially.
It's maybe learned behavior. It's what I've seen my dad do, and it worked for him. He got £10, or he got, and I find it fascinating because I think as professionals, like as a practitioner coming into that we've got to understand that nuance, because if we're then trying to have a conversation with a child after the fact about, well, why did you do that? Yeah, that's a delicate conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I do think this is one of the difficulties of the research as well. When you're talking after the fact, it's young people's understandings of why they do what they do, as not even just young people, adults' understandings of why they do what they do can change over time, and also change with memory. We all like to think of ourselves in certain ways. And I think sometimes when you're reflecting on why you might have done something, it might end up, you might end up framing it in a way that's favorable to you, or the opposite of that. You could be blaming yourself quite a lot heavily for what went on. So, and you could catch someone on one day or the next, and their framing could be different. So I suppose we always have to appreciate that any research conversations that you do, they are conversations that you're having with someone on a day, and they're constructed on that day through what you're saying, asking them through what they think you might want to hear as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing piece of research, and I would really recommend people read it, because I think that, yeah, you've kind of given us the highlights, as in, what reflects. But actually, I think if people are interested in this topic, you've done a literature review, you've really unpicked this. I mean, it's an amazing piece of research and a doctorate. Where can people find it if they want to find it, and somewhere where you can count how many people have read it? Is there somewhere like that?
So yeah, it's very kindly being hosted by Helen Bonnick on a website, Holes in the Wall. Right. So people can access it via that. I will be publishing articles based on it eventually. I'm sure my PhD supervisors are jumping up and down, hoping that that's going to happen anytime soon. So yeah, as soon as they're out, they'll also probably be on Helen Bonnick's website, I imagine. So she covers good ground. Yeah, that's it. So yeah, and if anyone's got any questions, they can message me as well at my Manchester Metropolitan email address. So I would say as well to encourage people to read it, because this is me talking about what young people are saying, and really, the research is supposed to platform actually what young people themselves say. So it's nice for people to read the actual PhD, even if you just skip to the chapters which have got young people's voices in it, because you can actually hear what they have to say about their experiences, which was fascinating, also sad, but yeah, really quite extraordinary in lots of cases.
So what next? What are you going to do with? I mean, you're going to write some articles, but you've got where else you'd like to go? What would be your aspiration this would be used for, and then what would you like to then do after it?
Yeah, well, I suppose I want it to be disseminated as widely as possible. So it would be good if it was embedded within sort of practitioner education, and any kind of inputs where you're talking about this issue, where predominantly the accounts come from parents and practitioners. That really we've got some of this, some of the young people's voice in there as well, to make this a bit more of a balanced account would be fantastic. And as much as possible, I'm trying to do sessions and lectures when we're thinking about, I work in the Department of Nursing at Manchester Metropolitan University, and we're embedding much more gender-based violence research within the curriculum there. So whenever there's any kind of curriculum that I think child to parent violence and abuse can be embedded within, I'm trying to do that, and then putting in this voice of the young person within that. So I suppose it's dissemination as wide as possible. Also thinking, that obviously the research has limitations, so it'd always be good to do to take this research a little bit further, make it a little bit more diverse. That would be good. It's obviously a limited sample in its size, and that means you're limited in terms of the diversity. Thinking from an intersectional perspective, it'd be great to have more young people who are care experienced, for example. That was a perspective that was captured within the PhD, but not necessarily explored as much as it could have been. Also, young people who are neurodivergent, again, it was captured to a certain extent in the PhD, but there wasn't the space to really, or the sample dedicated to that particular issue. And looking at differences across age. Some of my colleagues are doing really well at this, looking at that violence and abuse towards parents in those earlier years. How might that be different to where adult children are being violent and abusive to parents? So really looking along that life course perspective. My other area of work is domestic homicide, and parricide connects domestic homicide, I know it sadly, to child to parent abuse literature in a contested way. Not everyone agrees that is along a spectrum, but sadly I think it can be there in the more extreme cases. So yes, looking along that life course perspective would be something I'd be interested in doing, and continuing to try and tap into young people's perspectives, for sure.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, because I think it's a really important piece of research. I mean, I'm just not just saying that because you're on the podcast. I do think that it brings something to the party that we've not had. And in some ways, it does feel like it's an open playing field, this area of research, isn't it? Because there's just so little on it. But this is a really key text, and hopefully it will really make people think differently, and kind of people will build on it, hopefully. So is there any questions I haven't asked you that you were hoping I was going to ask? Final question.
No, I think it was good. I think it was good that we had a nice methodology chat at the start, because I think it is key into why this issue is not quite so covered in the depth that it is covered from young people's perspective. So that was good. And yeah, no, that's as I say, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone's got that they want to direct my way if they're interested.
What's your email address?
It's v.baker@mmu.ac.uk. Excellent.
I shall put that in the show notes as well, and hopefully you won't get bombarded. And it'll only be nice people asking nice questions. Vicky, it's been an absolute pleasure, Dr. Vicky Baker, to speak to you.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate you coming on, and I have a feeling we'll be hearing more from you in the future.
Hopefully, for sure.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stop recording.